Welcome to Day 2 of the Aspen Institute's Education Innovation Forum and Expo. Now, please welcome to the stage Jim Shelton, Assistant Deputy Secretary for Innovation and Improvement from the U.S. Department of Education.
Good morning. We're going to do it again. Good morning. Fantastic. I'm glad to see that almost everyone is here. I had a feeling when I was getting ready to head out around 12:30 last night and the lobby was full that it was going to be a slow trickle in. Welcome back to the second day, the second half day, I guess I should say, of this great event. I want to make sure that I don't forget to do something, which is make a simple request. And that is that many of you have come and walked right by one of the most important opportunities that you'll have here, which is to see some of the great opportunities that are being presented by the exhibitors in the exhibition hall. So during the breaks and things like that, if you could commit to seeing 3 things that you have not seen already, that would be great. The second thing I want to do is, a lot have been said about how great this event is and things like that, and I hope you feel that way. The reality is that somebody comes up with an idea, and then there are a ton of people who actually take that and actually make it happen. And so we can't thank enough the team from Aspen with Gary and Ann and Carrie and the whole Aspen team that pulled this together, and the folks at the Department of Ed like Taryn Benaroche and Jefferson Pestronk and Suzanne Emmerman who came through, and then the Guardian Angels that I don't even know about, like folks like John Bailey, and then obviously the folks who have been on the panel. So please thank you to all of you, and thanks to all of them. This morning we have a very special opportunity to hear from, frankly, almost the very highest level of the country about this agenda and its importance to our policy agenda, how it actually fits in, how it will shape the agenda for this president for the next 2 years, and what it actually means for this country. With that, I'd like to welcome up first Andrea Mitchell from NBC and Melody Barnes, the head of our Domestic Policy Council. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you all so very much. We're going to sit down and have a conversation. Why don't you all move up a little bit closer, those of you who can. Thanks. Oh, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I think we all agree that there can be no more important issue for our country right now than education. So it's wonderful that we have Melody Barnes here, the head of the Domestic Policy Council for President Obama, who has focused so intensively on education, along with Secretary Duncan. I know you heard from Arnie Duncan and a few other people yesterday on this subject, Gene Sperling from the White House. But we know as a nation that we all, as citizens, certainly we at NBC News, where Education Nation has been a hugely important commitment for us, a summit that we held this year, and we're going to be advancing and continuing in our programming throughout the year, and again in another major summit in the fall. So this is a commitment that we and all of us in the private sector, in the media, and certainly in government have to continue and intensively focus on. But what all of our friends here at the Aspen Institute and in the administration are looking at today with all of you is innovation and how we can challenge ourselves and find ways to be more innovative. And as we talk about this, Melody, let's start at the beginning. What is innovation when we are thinking about education?
Sure, absolutely. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here with you, Andrea. It's always great to talk to you. And congratulations to NBC for the work they've done with Innovation Nation. It's just been tremendous in getting the word out about how important this is for individuals, but also for our country. And thanks to Aspen Institute and all of you for being here so early in the morning. I mean, to your question, innovation, if you just boil it down to its simplest terms and take it out of the education context, it's about the development of new products, new processes, new services. And you can see how innovation has driven our country for hundreds of years, literally. As we've gone from an agrarian to an industrial society, you think about the rise of the computer age, and the president's favorite example is always the Sputnik moment. You know, how this space race drove our economy and also drove our education system. So then when we pull it back to education, you think about the fact that innovation changes not only what we're teaching, but I think even more importantly, how we're teaching it. And Arne Duncan, Secretary Duncan, who was here with you yesterday, often talks about taking the Department of Education from being a Department of Compliance to a Department of Innovation. How do we work with the private sector? How do we work with state and local institutions? How do we work with folks on the ground, innovators like all of you in this room, to create greater flexibility and more creativity in our classrooms, to give teachers and students more flexibility and more room to create that 21st century classroom, to change the way that people are thinking and the way that they're learning. That's what innovation is doing in our education system. That's what it has to do in our education system.
When we speak of innovation, are we speaking exclusively about technology?
No, it's interesting. People immediately go to technology, and technology is certainly an important tool in innovation, but innovation is so much larger than that. I mean, when we look at technology, we can think about the fact that it often helps us with personalized learning, for example. But innovation in education more broadly focuses on the ways that we can create more creativity, the way that we can help students think more analytically, and how we can use online, how we can use technology and those tools to try and spur that kind of thinking to provide our students with 21st century skills. So it isn't just about technology, though technology can play an important role in innovation in the classroom.
And when you, with some of the money from the stimulus recovery plan, put out proposals or solicited proposals for grants, you ended up funding 49 proposals, but you had 1,700 applicants, some $659 million spent around the country.
Right.
How do you sustain that, given the budget climate and what is inevitably going to happen in this next budget cycle?
Well, and your question is an important one because of those 1,700 applications. You think about it, and for those of you who are winners, who are in I3 winners, you are, the cream of the crop, but we have hundreds more out there who have really important, ingenious ideas for how we can turn around, how we can change the education system in America. And the question is, how can we sustain that and how can we scale it? Because that's another important component of innovation. It's not just that smart idea, it's how we scale it so others can benefit from it. What we found is that hunger that drove those 1,700 applications exists because people have been doing this in pockets around the country for years and years and years. The federal call, the leadership that Secretary Duncan and the President have provided to say this is important and we have to provide room to scale it up and the resources to do it is evident, but we have to do that in concert with the private sector. I mean, we often think about VC, about venture capital in the private sector alone, but it is also about a partnership with the public sector and leveraging that $635 million that you were talking about with private dollars so that we're able to scale it. And the private sector has responded in spades, not just in this context and the I3 program we're talking about, but you also look at the Promise Neighborhoods program, which is a program that's based on the work that Jeff Canada has done at the Harlem Children's Zone. You look outside of education, the work we're doing with the Social Innovation Fund that's at the Corporation for National and Community Service, the work we're doing around STEM education and Change the Equation, and that partnership with CEOs all over the country. And you can find these great partnerships that are going to allow us to sustain this, but there's more and more and more that we can do.
Now, all of these applicants had to come up with matching grants, with 20% matching grants. What is the impetus for people here today, for the private sector, to say, I trust the government and I want to get involved in this, and I don't think that the money that I put up is going to be wasted?
Well, a couple of different things. One, all of this is based on metrics and evaluation. So what we're doing is we're taking, in the I3 context, as many of you know, ideas that are emergent, that have, there's a theory of the case behind them, but providing them with small grants so they can further develop those ideas. We're taking ideas that have some methodology, that have some research base behind them, but we need to learn a little bit more about them, putting greater resources behind those. And then there are those ideas that have been tested, that have been well-researched. We know, in fact, that they work. They've gone from promising to kind of promised. And we're putting even larger grants behind those so that we can scale them up. So all of this is based on research and, as I said, metrics and evaluation, and consistent with the size of the grant, and then the scaling out to communities around the country. So this is based on science and data, and not just a sense of what may or may not be a good idea. And it's the same kind of work that people are doing in the private sector all the time when they're taking good ideas and deciding to put funds behind them, sometimes starting out with small grants, but scaling that up when they see the real promise behind those ideas.
These 49 programs that are now actually in effect, can they be sustained? Do they need another round of budget money when the stimulus program ends? What's going to take over?
Sure. Well, this is something that Secretary Duncan, something that the President firmly believes in. So you'll see that reflected in the work that we do in the years to come. I mean, this isn't a one-time deal for us. The President firmly believes that innovation is going to drive education and it's going to drive the economy, and we have to make investments there and we have to put our resources there, and that's something that we're going to be fighting for. And we're also hoping that those who are working with us will be, the proof is always in the pudding. So they will be the proof points that prove to people that this is something that has to be continued. And I think this also goes back to the question you were just asking. Why would people want to invest here? I mean, in addition to the fact that there's the data that supports the work that's being done around the country, the reality is that this is critical. This is necessary. If we aren't going to turn our education system around, if we aren't going to be indeed best in the world, and we know the recent statistics that have been put out show us that we have been sliding further and further behind, then it has a direct effect on the economy. It has a direct effect on the private sector. I've spent a lot of time talking to CEOs around the country, and some of them say to me, if my shareholders knew how much time I spent thinking about, talking about, and working on education, they might be surprised. But we do it because this is the most important thing for us over the next decade. So their engagement with us means that we're creating a workforce that will better ensure that the private sector thrives, that our economy thrives, and that we are more competitive and that we're growing as a country.
How much of a barrier in some of these projects is the teachers' union, in that Jeffrey Canada said, when he looked at the union contract, it's a 200-page contract. And he said in the Harlem Children's Zone, every time he wants to try something new, he can't go back and worry. He doesn't have to go back and worry because he doesn't have unions in his schools about whether or not it meets this or that demand in the union contract.
Sure. Well, I think when we look at education, it's really important for us as a country to not look for the single answer or the single problem, because there's a lot of diversity in what we need to do as a country to make sure that we have the best education system. And teachers' unions, just like the private sector, just like the philanthropic sector, can be and have proven themselves in many cases to be part of the answer. When you look at Race to the Top, this is another area of innovation for us. This $4.3 billion fund that came out of, as you were mentioning a second ago, the stimulus dollars. And that's allowed us to really spur education all over the country, not just the 12 winners, but in those other states that were trying to compete, trying to put themselves on the best footing so that they could compete to win those grants. When you look at the winners, what you find is that they brought the political infrastructure of their state, the unions, management, parents, the NGO sector around the table to come up with the best and the most competitive plans so that they could be successful and they could win. So that shows and that proves what we believe, which is if you can put everyone around the table and you can get results. And they were rewarded by that in terms of those first 2 rounds of RTT funding.
One of your next big challenges, Secretary Duncan has said, is going to be the rewriting of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act and No Child Left Behind. How do you see the relationship between the White House and a new Congress in trying to come up with agreements
to get that done?
To get that done.
Well, a couple of things. First of all, we've been working on this now for 2 years. And what I've found since I've been in the White House is, one, that education is an issue that tends to transcend politics and ideology. You take those Race to the Top winners. I was talking about the diversity of the sectors that came together, but it was Republican and Democratic and independent. And no one was driving toward, this is the Democratic brand of reform or this is the Republican brand of reform. What they were driving for was the best ideas, and they were doing that across the board. What we've also found over the course of the 2 years is, in a bicameral, bipartisan way, we've had some really great conversations that seed the ground for reauthorization of ESEA going into this next Congress. We've developed relationships. We're going to be developing new relationships as we have some new chairmen that have come on board, and we've got new members of Congress on board. But those relationships exist, and the predicate for that, the blueprint that we put out, also exists. But I think the key ingredient are parents and teachers and principals and people in their hometowns all over the country. People are really motivated around education reform. They know No Child Left Behind. Name 5 or 6 laws that most people sitting around their kitchen tables can name. You can probably find very, very few. People know No Child Left Behind. They know that they want it fixed. I've been, I may have mentioned this to you before, grabbed in grocery stores and women's clothing stores when I go home to shop or wherever, and people say,
really?
Don't you, really? Do you work for the president? That's what I thought. No Child Left Behind, we've got to fix that.
Well,
There's a motivation,
the bottom
a
line
momentum.
is that no one likes it. That's an exaggeration, but when you talk about bipartisan agreements, it's because there is agreement that nobody really wants to live with this one-size-fits-all policy.
Exactly.
But when you boil it down and have to get to agreements between a Republican caucus that is somewhat fractured itself, between its Tea Party components and the more traditional Republican Party, and a Democratic White House and a Democratic Senate, how do you come up with any kind of consensus?
Well, first of all, you don't have to take my word for it. You look at comments made recently, post-election, by the new Chairman Klein, by Subcommittee Chairman Duncan Hunter, and they've said there's common ground here. There are places for us to work here. They've been working with George Miller, who is the ranking member of the House Education and Labor Committee over the last couple of years. Again, those relationships, we've been talking about these issues. Just because we haven't been doing this under the spotlight doesn't mean that those conversations haven't gone on. And I think, and this goes back to the fact that people, I think, believe in the accountability that was set forth and that principle from No Child Left Behind. But this lack of flexibility, the lack of innovation, the very reason we're here, people are looking for more of that. That is driven by or something that's embraced by the administration. It's something that's also embraced by the Democratic and Republican caucuses up there. And what we also have to do is articulate where we're going, what the vision is. And there is a vision for a 21st century school and a 21st century classroom that I think is exciting for everyone. It's exciting for students and teachers. And if you look at examples like High Tech High, that's in San Diego County, and I know there are a lot of great programs out there and a lot of great innovators in this room. This started out as a single charter school. There are elementary schools, middle schools, and high schools. And you look at it, literally the facility itself, the focus on teachers as guides for education, building on their expertise, support for them, support in terms of development and training that's built into that program, personalized learning for students so that it meets their needs where they are, their interests, but building and developing these analytic and creative skills, collaboration, communication skills, and doing that all towards a college and career-ready standard. They haven't articulated it in the way the governors have in terms of a Common Core standard, but the belief is that every kid in that school will go on to college, and they've proven it. 100% of those children have been accepted to college. 35% of them will be first-time college goers from their families. That's the vision, and it's a very diverse school. So this is talking about the population of the 21st century, getting the college and being prepared for college and career, which is a standard that we have to set, but doing it in the most flexible and interesting way, using technology as a tool, but also using the creativity of the teacher and the student to apply that to the learning experience. That is an exciting, innovative proposition. We can do it, and that's what people want, and I think that ultimately is what's going to drive us, because we've got to do it for our kids, and we have to do it for our country and for our economy.
And when you speak of this broader picture, the president in Winston-Salem, I think in that speech, first spoke of the Sputnik moment,
Right.
and perhaps on the anniversary, day after the anniversary, the 50th anniversary of John F. Kennedy taking the oath of office. It was really, and I'm of that generation as a child, we were told we have to start learning science all of a sudden because we're losing to the Russians. The Soviet Union is passing us. And JFK made it all seem possible in probably the most memorable inaugural address, other than Lincoln's second inaugural. But at the same time, when you look at the PISA scores, not only are they discouraging, we're 17th or 23rd in reading and math when we look at the success in the Asian countries and Finland and other places, but when you disaggregate it and see the disproportionate results from minority children, from African American and Hispanic children in our society, what makes us think that these new technologies can be applied universally and across our country in places like the District of Columbia, which do not have the computer systems that we have right across the border in Montgomery County, Maryland?
Sure. I think the thing that makes us believe we can do it is that we see it being done. I mean, I was just talking about High Tech High. I'm sure a lot of you come from districts and states where you see those kinds of results all over the place. Earlier this year, the President and Secretary Duncan were at Graham Road Elementary School, which is in Alexandria, Virginia, just over the bridge. The same kind of population, very diverse, low socioeconomic status, but that school is performing at the top level. First of all, it's believing and setting the goal that we are going to be a college and career-ready country, and ensuring that teachers and our school leaders are prepared and have the resources to do it, and that there's enough flexibility within the classroom so that they can meet the needs of their students. And it's also making sure that in addition to the standards that we have the appropriate assessments and the right kind of data so that we're constantly learning what do our kids know today, where are they falling behind today, how can I change that tomorrow? So it's that kind of innovation, the ability to innovate in that way and to use technology and data as a tool, but it's also just greater flexibility. We have got to focus on our lowest performing schools in a most rigorous way. But for those schools that are doing well, those schools that are showing growth, we need to give leaders and teachers greater flexibility so they can do what's necessary for their kids, and we know that we will see results. I mentioned Harlem Children's Zone and our Promise Neighborhood program. That's what Jeff Canada's doing there. That's what other great leaders are saying. They're saying every kid who walks in here, I don't care if you're from a single-family parent home, I don't care your race or ethnicity, I don't care about your socioeconomic status, I know you can do it, I know you can learn. That's our goal, and we're going to get it done. And we, with the limited federal resources that we have, are working to leverage those resources with the private sector to make sure that that can happen. And we see great partnerships and people moving into the school systems to support that. It can be done. It has to be done.
And what do you say to, let's say, Paul Ryan, just to draw a name, the new budget chairman? What do you say to a Republican skeptic who says we're spending more on our kids' education than all these other countries and getting less for the buck?
Sure. I would say I think we're spending more, maybe but for Luxembourg. But what we've consistently said is we have to have resources, but the resources have to be smart. They have to be tied to the reforms that are necessary to drive the kind of education system that we're all looking for. Again, this kind of innovation that's represented by the I3 winners and others who are in this room, the Race to the Top winners who are out there, the money that we're putting into STEM education, and the way that we're working with the private sector. So it's a smart use of dollars, and that's what we're looking for.
How do you get more women involved in, you speak of STEM, more women involved in science and math?
Well, that
more
is...
girls.
Yeah, absolutely. That is one of our key priorities when we focus on STEM. And the president has made STEM a priority. Before I answer that question, I do want to say this. We are also very supportive of and encouraging of, and if you look at our blueprint, it's there, of a well-rounded curriculum. History, the arts, music, all of that has to be there, and a lot of that is what incents a student, what brings them to school, and then they can use those skills and those interests to think about math. When you're doing music, you've got to think about math. But when I want to talk about STEM, we have said we are right now at the middle of the pack. You were talking about those PISA scores. The things that we have to do, we've got to focus on our curriculum. We've got to focus on ensuring that we move to the top of the pack, and we've got to focus on bringing more of our underrepresented populations into the STEM field. So that's women and girls, and that's people of color. So we've brought a specific focus to that. We've started an initiative that's called Educate to Innovate, and Change the Equation is this public-private partnership that we have under that umbrella. It is incredible. Again, people have rushed in to fill that space. We have CEOs all over the country who have joined and who sit at the helm of that and bringing their colleagues on board. And, I've participated myself in some really wonderful activities, National Lab Day, which I kind of call Match.com for, teachers in STEM education, where teachers will say, look, I want to teach a module on, in this particular case, it was the heart. And they've got, they post that online. Doctors and scientists and others from around the District of Columbia said, I'm happy to help you. And they've worked with them, and they've gone into the classroom and worked with the students, hands-on experience, a much more interesting experience for the students, building on what they can learn from their books, building on what they can learn online, and that's being replicated all over the country, and that's just one single example. So again, public-private partnership, focusing on the students that we need to bring into these fields, and doing that in the context of a I can't say this, well-rounded curriculum.
When the rubber hits the road, though, in local communities, we see what's happened in New Jersey and some of the other states and read about the unfunded pension liabilities. Schools seem to be the first thing that's cut, and the federal dollar isn't the most important dollar when it comes to education. So what message can we send to the private sector, to the voters, about how to address education at the local level?
Well, you're right. I mean, federal dollars are a fraction of what goes into the public education budget. And I think people looking at these scores, and I've talked to so many people, journalists, people who are constantly looking at and analyzing information, who have said, I was stunned when I saw that information. We need to make sure that people understand where we are right now, but also understand where we absolutely know we can be. We know we can be first in the world. We've got the resources, the information, the human capital to be able to do that. But we have to make the investment in education, and that's a message the president has and will continue to underline and underscore, but we have to do it in a smart way that's connected with the reforms, the kind of reforms that started taking place as a result of Race to the Top and what's going on in state legislatures around the country. And we also have to build on the work that governors and others are doing, and we have to do it, one, there's a moral responsibility to do it. We know that education is the single thing that can hurdle people into the American dream. That is, over any type of barrier that a person has, the one thing that can ensure success for our kids. But two, we also have to do it because as an economic matter, as a family economic matter, but as a national economic matter, it's critical for us and for our ability to compete in the future.
When you speak of the American dream, the whole question of immigration, the failure of the DREAM Act, but also, even though we focused on elementary and secondary education here, at the college level, we still have a college system that is really the gold standard for the world. Yet the immigration policy of the United States with H-1B visas, many of these companies, anyone here in the private sector would tell you that is a huge frustration, the limits on being able to hire people who graduate from our schools and then have to go back to their native countries, even if they want to stay.
And this is something that the President has and will continue to talk about, particularly in the context of comprehensive immigration reform. We've got to fix the system, and there are pieces of that include looking at our education visa policies, so we're not educating people here and then having them leave the country and take this amazing education that we provided them, and it's to the benefit of someone else and benefit of our global competitors, as opposed to the job creation opportunities that would exist here if we had people who were here, who were being entrepreneurs, who were building businesses. So that's very important. You mentioned the DREAM Act, and these kids who want to go to college, who want to serve in our military, that level of public service, and to be able to give them that opportunity. It was a shame. We were cutting off our noses to spite our face when we lost that vote at the end of the last Congress. But we will continue to fight for this in the context of immigration, of broader comprehensive immigration reform, because we know that it is so very, very important.
We don't see that broad immigration reform is going to be something that the administration and this Congress is going to really deal with, though, in any near term.
But we will continue to make the case that this has to get done. If it doesn't get done, it's because people are resisting fixing a broken immigration system. It's because they're resisting doing the things that are going to make us more economically competitive. And that choice is going to be there for Congress. But from the perspective of the White House, this is something that has to and must be done.
I want to be able to have some time for the audience to also ask you questions. We've got roving microphones and people to facilitate that, so it's a little hard for us to see given the lights, but please raise your hand or stand up and let's find the microphones over there. Yes, there are a couple of questions here. Let's start in the very front and then move back.
Thank you. Melody, that's been great. So it seems like most examples over the last 3 days of successful school systems would be charter schools. Do you think then policy is handicapping the leaders in public schools to be successful?
Your question was a little muffled. What was handicapped?
Can you hold the microphone a little bit closer?
So do you believe then the policy is handicapping the leaders in public schools to be as successful as charter schools?
Do I think that public schools are handicapped from participating in our programs as opposed to charter schools? Is that the question?
No. It seems like that most of the examples of successful 21st century schools are actually being shouted out as charter schools.
Charter.
So the flexibility that they have, I'm wondering whether the policy is handicapping leaders in public schools to be as successful.
Well, of course, many charter schools are public, but
right, they're part of the public system. But when you look, for example, at our Promise Neighborhood winners, again, another important area of innovation for us. In fact, the majority of the winners of those grants were public schools. Or traditional public schools versus charter schools. So we believe that flexibility can exist, and that's something that we want to drive, and that's part and parcel, one of the building blocks of our ESEA blueprint, to provide greater flexibility within the traditional public school system. But in terms of our awards, we are looking at all kinds of public schools, traditional and charter, to be beneficiaries of these awards and to be able to build on these exciting innovations, to partner with the private sector, to partner with NGOs that are in their school districts and in their states.
There was a question right there.
Good morning. Thank you. I'm Rob Lippincott from PBS. We're very proud of some of the work we've done with the Department of Education. And in schools, we think that it's not just about television. You were talking about not just about technology, but maybe interactivity. However, one of our proudest successes with the department is something called Ready to Learn. And it addresses the earliest. And we have found in all of our research that kids who start behind stay behind. Mm-hmm. And we realize that pre-K and early childhood programs are not part of the either federal or, in many cases, state mandate in terms of schooling. Can you address early childhood? We had high hopes for a bill that didn't come to pass last spring, mm-hmm. and I'm wondering if you can elaborate about future plans for early childhood support.
Sure, that's a great question.
It's especially appropriate as we all think about the legacy of Sergeant Shriver, who was really the innovator behind Head Start when he was at the in the anti-poverty program.
Absolutely, and a couple of things. One, we had high hopes for that bill, too. I remember negotiating that bill for a couple of weeks. This was our higher education bill, which actually had an early learning component to it, an important early learning component to it, because we've been big advocates for an early learning challenge fund, and we continue to be big advocates for it for the very reasons that you mentioned. We know that some of the best dollars invested are dollars invested 0 to 3. Because you get a huge return on investment in terms of education, health, the future benefits for those students. You make sure that when one of the, those cute little 5-year-olds walk into kindergarten, that there isn't already an achievement gap, a learning gap between some of those children and their peers. So that's something that we are going to be pushing for. We believe that early learning shouldn't just be a glorified babysitting service, that we have to think about how to drive the quality of that educational experience for our children so that they are ready to learn when they go into kindergarten, that we're connecting that early learning experience to the K through 12 system, and you can continue to see the benefits flow throughout elementary, middle, and high school. And if you look at, I know one of the winners here is there's a home visitation or home-based model program that is in collaboration with our Bureau of Indian Education schools to make sure in those 0 to 5 years that we've got certified parent educators who are going into homes, focusing on health issues, focusing on development issues, focusing on literacy and reading, helping parents better understand the development, the educational development of their small children, so that when those kids are going into school, we have closed and hopefully eliminated that achievement gap. That kind of innovation is exactly, I think, on point with what you're talking about, and being able to build on that and scale on that and share that experience with others will be critical. And I'll also use this just to say, one of the really important things about this innovation experiment and about this push behind innovation is that we don't keep that secret to ourselves, that we are creating a learning environment, a culture of innovation, so that we can share that information, others can build on it, others can use it, so it serves as a smart laboratory for education systems, and in this case, an early learning education experience for the entire country.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Good morning. I'm Randy Barth with Think Together. Promised neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. Is there going to be any implementation dollars? There doesn't seem to be. We're very excited about the initiative. There doesn't seem to be as much excitement about it on the Hill. And we saw that in the appropriations from the House and the Senate, and now with the Republicans coming in, prospects are looking kind of bleak. So what's your outlook for that? Sure.
This is a program, an idea that the president developed during the campaign. So for many of us, this is, a baby that we've been nurturing now for a couple of years. And we have seen the results in other communities, and we know how significant this is, particularly for high poverty communities. It continues to be a priority for us and for the president. You're right, we got that first round of funding for planning, and now have been pushing for that second round that will allow for implementation. The appropriations process from last year didn't provide us what we hoped it would be, and certainly now that we're in a continuing resolution posture, it's even more frustrating and more bleak. But that's something that we will continue to push for because of its importance. But again, going to your question about the private sector, it is a place where the private sector has stepped up wonderfully. I mean, at first looking, we had these 21 winners of our Promised Neighborhoods competition. But again, just like the I3 context, all these other applications that were really spectacular. And the private sector stepped up and said, how do we fund those that are ready to go to scale, who are those plans that are ready to be implemented but can't with federal dollars. So we want to continue to work with the private sector, see what we can get from this Congress, educate this Congress about this program. Several of us went up with Republicans and Democratic staff to the Harlem Children's Zone to help better explain what this program is. We'll continue to do that and continue to push, but also need to work with the private sector to try and fund that program.
Can we get the microphone to the center of the room there? Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Linda Katz, Children's Literacy Initiative, one of the Validation I3 grantees. In nursing in this country, there's one test for certification in the whole country, and we have a lot of faith in our nurses. There are 1,100 certification tests for teaching, and only a few states have a really good test to see if teachers know how to teach reading. The test was developed in Massachusetts. Not coincidentally, they have the highest reading scores in the country. Can that test be tied to ESEA?
Well, I won't speak specifically to that particular test. What I will say is that we have been looking, as we've been thinking about teachers and leaders, one of these important planks for Race to the Top that carries into the rest of the work that we do, the importance of teacher preparation, in teacher recruitment, preparation, retention, and pay. And what we've done is, one, suggest better ways to try and consolidate some of the funding streams and programs that exist at the Department of Education so that we can do this in a smarter way for states and localities and to create more flexibility and also encourage the best teacher certification programs, the smartest teacher certification programs that we can, because we recognize that is such an important plank of what we're trying to do. I mean, everybody knows it. I mean, that person that stands in front of the school, that stands in front of the classroom, is one of the most important elements for that learning experience for kids that exists. So we do have to get that right, and that's certainly something that we're thinking about and working with as part of our ESEA reauthorization.
Is that one of the biggest obstacles, though? Whenever you talk about teacher accountability, you are raising questions not only of the union, but of local control and of differing value systems among the states. So how do you find something that is standardized, raising the level, without confronting all of the pushback that you're going to get?
Well, again, consistent with the way that we've looked at all of this, again, that bottom 5% of schools, a much more rigorous implementation set of standards, because we've got to get that right. That's where our high dropout rate is coming from. But for other schools, we've been much more flexible. We're looking for greater flexibility, rewarding what works, rewarding growth in those areas. In other areas, and the example that I was just mentioning, I wasn't saying, and this is absolutely going to be the way that we do it, but we're working to try, and our teacher incentive funds in other ways, to try and incentivize the best and smartest ways to retain, recruit, and prepare teachers to provide adequate flexibility that meets the needs of the community. But again, we've got to set the goal. We've got to set goals, and we have to set standards so we know what we're going. I often say, if we're sitting here in Washington and we say we've got to say, I'm going to San Diego. Or else, if you don't know where you're going and you find out that you're in Florida, you don't know if you've gone in the wrong direction or not. So we've got to set a goal and we've got to set standards. We also have to create the right kind of flexibility for school systems and for states to be able to perform. And a lot of this has come by bringing the governors and others together as they've been thinking about the importance of education and those kinds of standards too.
Well, we've touched on a lot of issues and raised a lot of questions, which is a good thing. Questions that are going to be answered by the administration, by the Congress, and I hope by all of you, because I think what Melody and the President and all of the people from the Department of Education have been stressing is that this really is a public-private partnership, and without the private sector, nonprofit community, all of us in the media, there is no way that a challenge as great as the education crisis in this country, and it is a crisis, is going to be addressed, despite the best of intentions. So we thank you for your leadership.
Great. Well,
Thanks for taking the time
It's my pleasure.
to engage. And we thank the Aspen Institute for convening this most important summit. Thank all of you.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Thank you.
Thank you again to Andrea Mitchell from NBC News and Melody Barnes from the White House. Now, please welcome to the stage Gary Huggins, the Aspen Institute's Executive Director for the Commission on No Child Left Behind.
Good morning, everyone. As the eminence said, I'm Gary Huggins, the Executive Director of the Commission on No Child Left Behind. And we spend a lot of time at the Commission focused on the policy side of these conversations, a lot of time thinking about how we maintain a strong accountability framework that drives the demand for all of the innovations that we're talking about today and the exciting conversations we're having about the solution side today. And I want to remind everybody here, one of the very important reasons we're here is we've got a lot of folks out in the hallway here that represent the best of what we have on the solution side. As we talk about these policy conversations, as we talk about the potential, these are the folks that are leading the charge, and we encourage you to spend time with them. We're going to be following up with you. We're going to be telling you their stories. We're going to be talking about and keeping you up with what they're doing, but we want you to spend time with them here. We have a great panel coming up, a great discussion coming up. We're very excited about that. Immediately following this, we've got some special time carved out for those exchanges to happen. So spend time with those folks. Learn about what they're doing. They've been circulating. They've been with us. They've been participating in the program as well. But spend that time. Get to know them. It's worth the investment. So without holding up anymore, I want to introduce Susan Colby, who's the CEO of the Stupski Foundation, who will lead your next panel, and she'll introduce the great folks that she's brought together for this conversation about accelerating innovation. Susan has worked on these issues for a long time and thought about these issues in a long time, and particularly in the context of how do we move the dial for kids who are the least served by this system? How do we really start to use these innovations, use these opportunities to close achievement gaps and serve those, again, that have been stuck in struggling schools for so long? So without further ado, let me bring out Susan and her panel. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm kind of sad that everybody's so far back in the room, but glad that you're here this morning, and really honored to be here with an incredible group of people who have joined me up on stage. We're going to do something a little bit different, which is have people introduce themselves so that you can put their faces and names together. And what we're going to be talking today about is how to accelerate the change that we've all been talking about. So there's been a lot of conversation about innovation, a lot of conversation about the various pieces of innovation. And what I've asked these folks to do is to talk about how to accelerate change, and we're going to try to get really specific because there's so much to do. But we'd love to leave people with a few ideas about if we were waving our magic wands, what we would do first, and how we would get this done. So let's start by just having a quick round of introductions, and we'll start with Tom.
Good morning. My name's Tom Khalil. I'm with the White House. I work for two different parts of the White House, the National Economic Council and the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and I actually do have a magic wand.
Good morning. My name is Nicole Pinkert. I'm a visiting associate professor at DePaul University, also the founder of the Digital Youth Network, a program to develop media literacies for middle school students, and the co-founder of Remix Learning. It's a company creating the social networks. We have a booth here. Please stop by and visit.
I'm Roar Saxberg. I'm the Chief Learning Officer of Kaplan, so I look after the learning infrastructure and architecture of what we do across all of our million-plus students per year, and I'm trying to build magic wands.
Can I get one? I'm Sandy Spiker, and I'm from IDEO. And IDEO is an innovation and design consultancy, and we design tangible solutions like products and services, but also systems and strategies that address complex challenges. And at IDEO, I lead our work in education.
Good morning. I'm Michael Horn, and I'm the Executive Director of Aspen Institute, which is a nonprofit think tank devoted to applying the theories of disruptive innovation to problems in the social sector. And along with my co-founder, Clayton Christensen, and Curtis Johnson, I'm also the co-author of Disrupting Class, how disruptive innovation will change the way the world learns.
So again, I want to first thank the Aspen Institute and everyone for having us here, and thank these folks for spending their time with us. We have a really, really gifted panel here. I think all of us know that there are incredible opportunities out there to do better for our students. And one of the things that we struggle with is the gap between where we know our kids can be and where the tools we're providing them and their teachers with to get there. And we wanted to start out by talking a little bit about that gap and a couple of the barriers. And in particular, we wanted to start by talking about the R&D infrastructure or lack thereof. And we'll start with Tom on this, and then what I'm going to do is ask people to just have a bit of a conversation up here yesterday. When we were talking, we had an amazing conversation, and I almost wish we could have just had that right here. So we're going to try to replicate that a little bit, have a bit of a debate and a conversation about what's going on in the R&D infrastructure, and we'll start with Tom.
Sure. I think one of the reasons that there is a large gap between the potential of learning science and technology to improve student performance and what we actually observe in the classroom is that we invest very little in research and development related to learning science and technology. So if you look at K through 12 expenditures, we invest less than 0.1% in research and development. And so that's clearly one of the things that is slowing us down. The other thing is that the market for learning technology is not very attractive. So schools don't spend a whole lot of money, particularly on software. It's a highly fragmented market with 15,000 different school districts and lengthy adoption cycles. So I think that we have to look at both the supply and the demand for learning science and technology that has the potential to dramatically improve student performance.
There's actually a fun example of that just came out this morning. An article that I saw in the New York Times was describing some really interesting research about comparing things like for practice for students to see whether students will retain information for longer using just basically reading a passage or creating a concept map or doing a kind of a rehearsal practice test ahead of time. And it showed really distinct benefits from over the long haul for doing the rehearsal practice. And so you look at a piece of research like that. So first of all, it's fabulous that it's coming out of the New York Times, right? This is relevant to practice and to all this. And yet, when you look in our hall in the back there, especially among the entrepreneurial ventures, you don't see many folks kind of doing this. This is not the 50th company after the same problem of how do we get learning to work better in science and technology using some research that's actually out there. And so just what I think you said, Tom, is right, that there's some block, there's some miss between research papers that are really piling up. There's actually an amazing amount now known about how media can affect learning and improve learning, how media can get in the way of learning, and techniques, even subject by subject, that make it work better. But they're not getting through to scale, to practice. They sometimes accidentally get into small networks, but they're not getting through to scale. And maybe that is the buyers, but it's one of the problems.
So I think one of the things, we had a conversation about this in the green room, and one of the things that was pointed out is that if you use an analogy of a relay, and if we compare education to medicine, in medicine you have the basic research, which is what the New York Times article reported. But then you have the biotech firm who takes that and takes it to the next level. And then the pharmaceutical companies step in and create the drug that doctors buy. What we don't have is who are the biotech players in the education space. So we have the basic research, and in exactly this example he pointed out, 10 years ago, John Bransford created a tool called Betty's Brain that did the exact same thing. Great research data that shows the impact, but there was no one to hand it off to take it to the next level.
Yep, exactly. It's very hard.
On top of that, we also don't fundamentally have a market that rewards success and quality. And so when the demand side is that broken, it's very easy to shoot products down a pipeline and everyone sort of gets a hockey stick chart that shows their thing. And we don't have money tied to outcomes generally, so it doesn't reward following a lot of the times that research base, which is a huge problem. And it's really on that demand side, when it's broken and doesn't reward the right things, that seems to clog up a lot of this innovation. And when we think about outcomes, what do we want to reward and so forth, and you look at our system, we have a system intensely focused on the inputs. how do we do things, what bucket of money can this and can't this be used for, and so forth, that hamstrings, which is, as we study innovation, anathema to promoting innovation. What defining outcomes and the capabilities is actually very uplifting to innovators because they know what to shoot for and what that golden standard is.
Go ahead.
Well, I think one of the things that often happens is that a lot of this research gets designed in absence of the people who are going to be delivering it. And so there's not a connection between the lives and the values and the ethics and mentalities of teachers, who are the agents of that. And also often we're forgetting to design with students in mind. Today's learners are very different, both from in the youth and also in the adults. And we're not necessarily embedding in that research a consideration of the way that people are engaging today.
In fact, that relates to the earlier conversation with Melody Barnes. It's absolutely right. It sounds right. The Department of Education wants to become more of an innovation organization. But actually, so do the State Department of Education, right? Because to your point, they are the ones who work with teachers. The districts, too. They need to have more experience thinking about innovation and, frankly, buying based on successful data. Mm-hmm. And I think right now a lot of our buyers who are out there who make these important decisions that actually drive the real economics, I'm not sure they're that familiar with how to evaluate innovations and data. And, they're not used to demanding that from publishers or providers or even folks who are going to train teachers, right? It's like, well, show me that this training technique makes a difference that works for students. Yeah. That's actually a hard thing to do, but you'd like the market to be pulling that.
So can we talk a little bit about evidence and data here? Because one of the things that has been a big debate in the i3 awards and all kinds of things is this notion of, well, is innovation really subject to data and evidence, and can we really prove that these interventions make a difference in kids' lives if they're so innovative? So let's talk a little bit about data and evidence and how we can use data and evidence to really spur where we're trying to get to for kids.
If you look at many industries, people are fairly flexible and comfortable with the notion of different types of data at different scales of work. Again, the medical side, pharmaceuticals, what you need is a proof of concept or to feel like you're going in the right direction while you're doing something in a lab. You don't need 20,000 patients and a multi-year, multi-trial study. That's a waste of money because 90% of what you do is not going to work. So you do a few people, you see, does it tie up with things that have worked before, and eventually you say, this is good enough to go to the next stage. And I think some of the IES work and their RFPs are designed to follow that, to kind of have scaled inputs from data. And so the question is, how do we get our implementers to be thinking about that as well, to be thinking about innovation and small amounts of data without saying no data. I don't want to look at data. And that's hard.
Well, we're also in an interesting period of time where the technologies, I think the very nature of the technologies that we're using to educate kids are changing. Exactly. And many of the I3 requirements required a level of data that meant that these tools and these approaches have been out for a long period of time. And so I think we have to figure out some creative ways to make sure that you're doing innovations that have proof, but that you're not, in some sense, inhibiting innovations that are really taking advantage of the cutting-edge technologies that are out here.
I think one of the opportunities in either an online or blended environment is the ability to instrument the learning environment and then to be able to use that environment to enable rapid, low-cost experimentation. So that's some of the research that DARPA is funding. And you see other academic researchers figuring out how to take that data and to drive tighter feedback loops with the student, the teacher, the course designer, and those researchers that are interested in the science of learning. So we should be able to create courses that get better the more students use them.
Tom, can you talk a little bit more about DARPA and what a DARPA-like institution in education might be, and anything you can share on that?
Sure. So for those of you who are not familiar with the organization, after Sputnik, the United States created a flexible organization called the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency that was designed to ensure that the United States was not subject to that sort of technological surprise. And they were given a very broad mandate. They recruit some of the best and brightest from the country, and they identify areas of investment that they think are high risk and high return that are not going to happen through business as usual. And out of that has come an incredible outpouring of technologies that have relevance to both national security but also to our economy. So we've seen the internet, GPS, electronic design automation. And so I think a number of people have fantasized for a while, what if we had something like that for education and for other national goals? And the Congress and the administration have gotten behind an organization that is playing a similar role in the area of energy called ARPA-E. And last year, the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology called for a similar activity that would do for education what DARPA has done for the military. And so if you see some of the technologies that DARPA has been investing on the military training, they have a program that is delivering some phenomenal results. So new Navy recruits, after a few months, are outperforming IT technical experts who have been with the Navy for 7 years. So what if we were able to take some of those similar methodologies and make those more broadly available on the civilian side?
So to the panel, if we were to have something like that, what could you imagine some of the objectives being for that work? And get as specific as you can.
Well, the whole realm of personalized learning and figuring out where are the best places to use things like simulations that have done, quite a lot of good in places like the military, but are very expensive to do. So the ability to go after that would be exciting. Another aspect that's really, I think, very exciting is where learning science and technology actually go together. Because too often, as we heard earlier, people think innovation means applications of technology. Whenever you do that, you end up having a lot of failures if you only start from technology. What you really want to do is solve your problem first. What's the science? What are good practices? What do the best tutors and teachers actually do? And then use technology to scale that up, make it cheaper, and so forth. And one of the areas that learning science is showing is very powerful is when you have the teaching deeply tied to tasks, to specific deliverable tasks, rather than having a lot of abstract conceptual stuff that goes on for a long time. And the neat thing about doing that is if you arrange these learning environments with simulations and with data coming off them automatically as you are actually trying to solve the tasks, you actually get a rich array of data coming out at the same time as you have practice environments going on. Mm-hmm. But actually doing research on that and trying that in different areas and so forth, boy, that's pretty pure. It's an engineering thing. It's pretty expensive. And that's the kind of area where, major federal funding could, break the log jam that would prevent folks from spending the money to actually investigate this. So that's the kind of thing that I would think would be pretty exciting to go after.
Yeah, I think if you could, so there's an interesting tension between the R&D, obviously, of R&D, research and design, and I think sometimes we get so caught up with very particular applications of something that we trend too much toward the D of that, and not enough on the basic R when we really look at that. And I think, Bror, the approach, one of my own policies is never to opine on something that you opine on better than I do. But yeah, but I think that the approach you just outlined, where we really look at what's the problem we are trying to solve and get rather specific about it, and don't prejudge, gee, we're really excited about this simulation or this game or so forth, and really open up to understand the fundamental mechanisms and fund that in a way that the private sector would not do, that basic research and so forth, and then really open it up to start moving into the design question of how would this actually now work on the ground with actual people, which gets into some of the conversations we were having yesterday about how would you galvanize learning networks to actually be a part of this second half of this equation.
Well, one more point on the research side. In a way, educators who are out working with students are very uncomfortable failing their students, right? I mean, they should be uncomfortable failing their students. We want them to be uncomfortable failing their students. But the result is it's not natural for them to engage in activities that have 80% failure rates, right? Because they don't want to fail, right? Now, innovation in all areas, people who do real research and innovation, The whole point is 80% of what you do is going to fail. So what you want to do is you want to instrument for failure and then celebrate those few and far between successes. Because it's the failures you don't expect that you really learn from. But that's a cultural shift again. You need people who are excited to fail in smart ways. And because that will progress the field and get things going. And that's where the funding for failure in some ways, for smart failure, and researchers and resources have to come in.
Sandy and then Nicole.
Yeah, I wanted to build up something that you were just saying, which is I really love the idea of having a centralized unit that's really looking deeply at R&D questions in education. I think that's phenomenal. And at the same time, I think that our challenges are too great to keep a centralized group alone really doing the deep investigation. And so when you ask about what objectives of an initiative like this could be, I think it would be really amazing to look at what's different about education than the military and then healthcare, and say, what do we design in, realizing that we have a system that requires infinite flexibility for the diversity of what it's trying to achieve? And how do we listen to all of the innovations that are happening on the ground and create a feedback loop into that centralized focus so that there's a dialogue between what's happening every day and what happens under that initiative?
Mm-hmm. Most of the last couple of days when we've been talking about education and learning, we've still been focused on the schoolhouse, on what takes place in the schoolhouse, and we're not adding into the equation all the places where kids are spending their time, where they're learning, but we have no way of connecting that learning in bringing it to bear in the school. But technologies are there that allow us to connect learning across all these different places. So part of the challenge, I think, is reframing the learning ecology or the learning networks that you talk about, and to make learning the everyone's responsibility in the community to do that, but to link data, to bring common standards together, such that what I'm learning in the Y can be made relevant for what I'm learning in the school space.
And that notion of bringing data together and what's happening in the home together with what's happening in classrooms, that's another really unexplored area of technology. At Kaplan, we're actually doing a pilot where we have an adaptive homework engine that uses trajectories of learnings to decide what homework to do next. And it actually feeds to the teacher the next day recommendations for which students should do different kinds of group practice together because of the nature of their learning and where they're at, so that kids who need the challenge and are ready to go, they do that kind of work, and kids who really need some more scaffolding, that they're set up to do that. And the idea is let's keep cycling things like that. So, and the opportunities to go back and forth between what you're doing outside, literally the classroom walls, and have data follow you, that comes from the technology as well.
Well, can I challenge one?
Of course.
So I think one of the challenges we have is if what we think by expanding the learning ecology, we just take the same instructional practices that take place in the home or in the school and put them into the home. So it's not necessarily to say, well, let's take this computer tutor and have kids have access at home. But there are affordances of the places where kids spend their time outside of school that bring in new types of activity structures.
Very true.
So what I'm going to do in the Y, or what I might do at the museum, the type of activity is going to be different, but at the core it's still using some of the same knowledge that I'm using in the school day. So we have to be able to articulate the learning in the out of school space as relevant and pulling on the skills that the kids need in the school day. And then we have a way, hopefully, which we've seen happen, of helping kids understand that it is important when I'm learning in the school day because I can bring it to bear in things that are more meaningful and relevant to me in the out-of-school space.
The connection.
You asked for a specific learning objective that could motivate a research program, and one that I think could be very powerful is whether we could do something about the huge gap in vocabulary size and school readiness that occurs before kids even enter the classroom. So in Beverly Hills, there are 199 age-appropriate books per household for kids, and in Watts there are 0.02. So I don't believe that technology could eliminate those types of disparities, but I do think it would be worth pursuing whether the advances in technology that we're seeing in areas like speech recognition, text-to-speech, cloud computing, AI, game design, could at least significantly narrow those large differences in size and sophistication of vocabulary that are occurring at a very early age, and that all the literature suggests persist. So that would be an example of a research project that I would get excited about.
I think this is a very important point because there's not a lot that education researchers agree on. Even Brewer would say that, I think. This is one of them that they do, which is that vocabulary gap that manifests itself very early, even before pre-K, is something that you can, with unbelievable correlations, track back to how they will actually perform in school and in life as they go out based on the number of words that they've heard from 0 to 18 months. And technology, to this point, has not shown that it can actually really make a big impact in that. In fact, we've seen that in some cases TV does the opposite because kids know to tune out. They know it's not someone talking to them, engaging with them, and what we in our book called language dancing and so forth. And so to start doing some very concerted experiments and research on that question, I think is huge. And just the techniques that you named, I think, are right on. And it could really galvanize the sector in a very meaningful way in an area, from my perspective, that's attractive because it's an area of non-consumption, area where you're not competing with the existing system, so you really actually do have that freedom to reimagine and reinvent what that experiences could look like.
Let's shift a little bit to the kind of demand side of this and the fact that many, many people think that the demand for these types of tools is broken. And want to talk a little bit more about non-consumers, but also want to talk about the current consumers as well as students, which we haven't talked about as much as I actually would like to. So who would like to kick us off for talking about a little bit of how we think about ways to help demand be smarter?
Well, there's an idea that the global health community came up with that I think is really compelling, and there may not be a perfect analogy to the education sector, but I think it's worth exploring. The global health community faced a real market failure, which is that pharmaceutical companies, for understandable reasons, are not interested in investing a lot of resources in vaccines for diseases of the poor. Male pattern baldness is a more attractive target for them than vaccines for people who are living on $1 a day.
And you don't understand that?
I don't understand that. And so what the idea that several economists came up with is called an advanced market commitment. And it is, the way to think about it is a purchase order for a product that doesn't exist yet. So 5 countries plus the Gates Foundation pledged to the pharmaceutical industry, if you develop a vaccine which is safe and effective, we commit that we will buy X million doses at Y dollars per dose. And they put $1.5 billion, and that was enough to get the attention of the pharmaceutical industry. And as a result, there are now vaccines that are available to children in developing countries for a vaccine that will help prevent pneumonia and meningitis and sepsis that will save the lives of 7 million kids over the next 20 years. So typically there can be a 15 or 20-year time lag between when a vaccine is available in developed versus developing countries, and they've essentially eliminated that. So that's really powerful. So what might the analogy be in the education area? It would be the emergence of some coalition of the willing. It might be a collection of virtual high schools or large school districts or states or other players who say, we've identified a specific learning outcome where there is a reasonably high degree of consensus that A, this is important, and B, we know how to measure it. And we are willing to commit that we would purchase a next-generation learning environment, whatever that would look like, that would reliably deliver that learning outcome. So you might say, a dramatic improvement in a specific area of middle school math and science, or early vocabulary size, or whatever the learning outcome that you wanted to measure. And that might be an effective way of creating the sort of smart demand that you were talking about. So I think the concrete next step would be to have a discussion about if you could write any RFP specifying a learning outcome that is ambitious but achievable, what would it be? And what's the coalition of the willing that you could build around it wanting to achieve that learning objective?
I mean, if you stay for a moment with the more traditional, side of education before moving to the really important areas of parents and families, what do they demand and how does that work? buyers, how do we educate them? How do we incent buyers to actually be asking their suppliers for data on effectiveness, for how does this work for learning? In many cases, when you go talk to people who are publishers or who create innovations, and you ask them, hey, did a district ask you for data? If they're asked for data, it's often not very insightful. They just want a chart that shows a little bar and a big bar because that will check the box off that research has been done. But what's missing is, where's the really insightful look to say, no, I want to understand, why is this better than what I'm doing now? Tell me how you tested this. How does this work? Let's do a pilot here. So you wonder, should there be more competitions around buying processes, that there's some rebate or subsidy that comes if you're using a really high-quality buying process to actually solve a hard problem, so that you get awareness and then obviously training about what does a really good buying process look like. It's odd right now, the market signals are not so clear to innovators and entrepreneurs that people really want to pay good money for these things. And so in addition to central signals like you're talking about, Tom, how do we get the whole machine to start to evolve its buying processes?
Well, go ahead.
Okay, well, one thing I wanted to add on to that is really understanding the end users of the things that you're creating. And so it's very easy for us to talk about students and the sort of the world that students are living in today and how we have to be designing for them in the ways that compel and engage them, absolutely. And at the same time, teachers are also very significant users of the materials that get created in the system. And we were recently doing some observations of teachers who were getting a new set of materials that were district chosen. And they were going through this training experience, and it was this very comprehensive, here's why, here's what you have to do, here's instructions about Monday morning. And we interviewed teachers after this experience, and one of them really stands out to me as the sort of iconic challenge to always be thinking about, where she was saying, yeah, this is wonderful and all, but when am I going to have the time to laminate these materials? Mm-hmm. And we can think all we want about the complexities of thought and rigor and discipline and data and evidence and all of this that goes behind it. But if we don't solve the lamination question, it doesn't work.
Absolutely.
It doesn't work.
That's an engineering problem.
But
yes.
and this is actually something I'd love to dig into, is how to make what we do easier for teachers, how to make their lives easier as opposed to layering on another set of things for them to deal with.
I wanted to go briefly back to the buyer question. And this idea or thought just popped in my head. And when we're talking about buyers, we're talking about the state or the district who's making decisions about what kids are going to use. If we use the analogy of games, the buyer is often the student. They're making the decision about what they use. And oftentimes, a good game is not something that every single person is playing. You make choices about what's relevant to you. Imagine, and many of you have kids, if you were, as a mother, buying a game for a 15-year-old, you probably wouldn't buy a game that kid would actually really want to use. So we have to come up with some more creative ways of putting buyer power selection in the hands of users and kids. And we have examples of with app stores and things like that where you can take the price point down smaller, create smaller units, and cheaper that kids can use. And so we need to explore some ways of creating more customized apps that we empower kids to purchase, and we can make sure that we're only allowing them to purchase things that have been proven of some particular type of quality.
Exactly. And I think...
Michael?
My head's going 10 different directions right now on the questions that are out there. I think, so one quick thing is, from our research, as we see this emerging disruptive innovation of broadly defined online learning that's going to be in distance environments, it's going to be out of school, it's going to be in blended environments, say nothing of that for a second. A danger that we have as we think about designing the products and services for increasing these learning gains is that we take the current world, the current classroom structure, the current way it's always worked as a given and not rethink how this new system might come together. And so that's something that is constantly hitting me because there is this emerging new system that we're maybe not designing optimally for because, and then to go back to the demand question, you look at what we reward right now through our funding, we reward people like me sitting in seats like this right now, seat time. That's what we pay on, based on attendance, not based on learning. We have a system intricately built around Carnegie units, around seat time, around funding on certain drop days, but depending on how many people are there. We don't have a system that works based on competency-based pathways that funds excellence. There's an example of the Florida Virtual School. There are a couple others, but that's about it. We incentivize the wrong things up and down, and so it shouldn't be a mystery that we get the buying decisions that we get because we pay for what we incentivize from policy.
So I want to ask the panel one more question, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. So get ready to ask your penetrating questions. The last question for us is one of the things I think about a lot, and this is building on what you just said, Michael, is that we're moving to, I believe, a very different system, a very different shape and size, and things are going to look very different. And at the same time, we're living in today's system, and our kids are in today's system. And I like to think a lot about, I had a conversation with Reed Hastings about Netflix at one point, and he was talking about how he is constantly building for the future, which is streaming media, while he uses the post office for today. And I thought it was a great analogy for education because you can't think of an institution that has been more about compliance historically than the post office while you're building for this kind of new world. And how do you use the today's system as well as you possibly can as you're bridging to the future? So I'd love to get people's thoughts on that and then open it up to the audience.
Part of that may be networks. You mentioned earlier learning networks, the idea of collections of schools who begin to get used to using innovations and trying new things and flexing their own boundaries. So that's not the same as blowing up the model and starting over, which in some ways needs to happen as well. But, you also want to get the express mail package innovation out of the post office, right? So you also want to get networks of schools and teachers and students and parents who begin to use these technologies in different ways. And I think having them get used to that, and now most folks are not used to that, is one aspect of that puzzle about how to get things implemented and out while beginning to look ahead.
Yeah, one thing I was going to say was what you were asking reminds me of a quote. The future is already here, it's just not widely distributed. And I think of what we were referring to as learning networks in our discussion yesterday around, in a way, leading-edge innovations in school. So we have High Tech High was mentioned this morning, we have KIP, we also have different models now that are academic partners like Expeditionary Learning that's out there and New Tech, what they're doing. And so these are innovations that are going to help us learn for many different conditions. The trick is, of course, learning from them and creating the space in the system, because what Netflix can do is they can have it under one question, one umbrella. And so how do we make sure that the rest of the system sees itself as connected and identified, and that these experiments in how we address particular questions feeds back into the system?
One of the interesting pieces from the statement of Reed is that he's using the post office, the existing infrastructure, but his solution in the future is not using that infrastructure, it's using broadband. So are we willing to imagine a different infrastructure of schools, and that the schoolhouse as we know it isn't at the hub? If we keep thinking that the schoolhouse is the center, then everything still has to lead back through the school, and so at that point you still have to do your innovations through that hub.
But that's where making competency the center of focus, right, instead of the schoolhouse the center of focus, is maybe the hammer to crack the rock, right? Which is, no matter where you get it, whether it's from an out-of-school experience, as you and I were talking about, you're working someplace, if that is how you gain competency in financial matters, and you can demonstrate that in a competency-based task that people later in the chain would say, yeah, that's what I need, well, then that should be fine. You shouldn't have to be sitting for hours in a chair if you've gotten it somewhere else.
Yeah, and
I was going to say, so Common Core has gotten some attention here, obviously, to these questions. The interesting thing that maybe hasn't gotten as much attention is the assessments off of that. And Stacey Childress yesterday, the Gates Foundation, said something really important, which is that the market signals for making great assessments that really measure learning and can show it are weak. And so that's a place where the Gates Foundation and other philanthropies and government are playing to work on it. We have these two coalitions right now designing these next-gen assessments. I think making sure those just aren't incrementally better, but really say, you did learning outside of school, well, we can prove it. Or you did learning inside of school, we can prove it. And people trust it. Experts from across the field, from teachers to researchers to Michael Horn on the street, trust it is a critical part of whatever we do for managing both the emerging system as well as what we have today.
There's also underneath that a mindset shift that's about education and school are not one. Right. That notion of that learning can happen outside of school, learning can happen in different ways, and that we can learn to look at that and value that in the current system, then creates even more diversity in the how we help kids learn, and then that helps us also innovate within the system.
Well, one of the things that we're thinking about at Kaplan is this idea of transition matrices of skills, especially for adult learners. 10 years out of school, they have a vast array of skills they've built up that aren't on transcripts. Yeah. And so what you'd love to do is get a diagnostic information about where they are and then the competencies they're trying to get to. And then learning should be a transition matrix, right? You don't waste time on things that are important for where they're going that they already have, but focus in on where there are gaps for where they're trying to go. And again, that has nothing to do with a schoolhouse or a lecture hall or 180 hours or 5 Carnegie units. That's about your skills now and the skills that are needed and validated to be what experts have. Cognitive task analysis can help with that, and off you go from there. So that's the idea.
Yeah, there's an interesting implication out of that, which is someone was asking me recently, what's the right percentage goal that we should be shooting for to have people with post-secondary degrees? And I've always felt it's sort of the wrong question. But then I flipped on it and said, well, the answer is actually 100%. That's right. Because everyone ought to have just what you just talked about that says this is what I can do in competencies, right? So
that
the answer ought to be
100%.
Right?
Yep.
Yeah.
So economic growth and rising standards of living flow from continuous improvements in productivity. So the fact that standards of living double every 23 years, if you have even a 3% productivity growth rate, should tell us something about the importance of continuous improvement. And I think there are a lot of ideas that we're seeing bubble up from the technology community and the research community about how we might use these new technologies to create an infrastructure for continuous improvement. So I think that is definitely one path that we should be pursuing in the same way that, an online recommender system gets more powerful the more people use it. We ought to be able to do the same thing using online and blended learning.
So you all have heard a lot from this panel. I want to turn it to the roving mics out there. And you all have a few seconds to think about. After the question and answer, we are going to come back to you for your magic wands. Right here up in front. And please identify yourself and your organization for us.
My name's Jim Colmoose from Knowledge Alliance, and this is a terrific panel. I wish more people would have stayed to hear what you have to say, because
Me too.
This is the nexus. You go to an innovation conference normally, and there are no R&D people here. You go to an R&D conference and no innovators there. The Aspen Institute was smart enough to involve a lot of R&D folks here. A lot of members from the Knowledge Alliance are here. So really appreciate this focus. And I know the Stupsky Foundation has been doing a lot of work in this facilitation between the R&D community and the innovation and improvement and transformation work that you're doing. I wanted to come back, though, to a concept that Sandy Spiker brought up about, from IDEO, this importance of focusing on problems of practice and ultimately solving problems for an end user. And there's a tremendous gap between what goes on in the research enterprise and the end user. And in other sectors, there are intermediary organizations that are sort of doing a brokering job, brokering knowledge, facilitating relationships. In education, there are some. The regional education labs, for example, provide a knowledge brokering concept, but it's still small relative to the immensity of the problem. And I'm wondering if you can think ahead to what would an ideal R&D infrastructure look like that really is and serves as a catalyst for innovation and ultimately improvement and transformation?
Well, especially around practice. There's sort of software tools that need to evolve, and they can evolve on their own time frame, and that's easier. Actual human beings doing their work better and better, that's not easy. I think about game tapes. Professional athletes, they work off game tapes. They do coaching, they have themselves monitored, then they have folks sit down with them and say, how did this do against the ideal practice? We had a goal for this. Did you achieve it? You were in front of the fourth graders. This was the fractions lesson. How did we do compared to what we were doing last year? Let's look at the tape last year. Let's compare this year. What do you think? And some research structure and development structure and coaching structure that builds up around game tapes, collections of those, snippets of those. The Gates Foundation is doing some interesting work on that and so forth. Maybe a way to get at this really hard problem of how do you at scale work to find the best behaviors of people in this system. But that's a thought.
Chris Anderson, who's the curator of TED, has an awesome talk on what he calls crowd-accelerated innovation. And what he points to is these 6-year-olds doing these incredible dance moves that they have learned from other kids and other dancers. So there's a model that the United Kingdom has embraced called Teachers TV, and that something like that might be really interesting in terms of building a broader community of practice within the United States.
Any other questions?
I just quickly, I hate being the one to keep sound this note, but if policy doesn't reward those behaviors to improve performance, then and dollars don't actually meaningfully follow it, then it probably won't happen either. So I do think there has to be alignment there as well.
That buying side.
Yeah, can I build on that question? Because thanks, Jim. It was a great question. One of the things, it's hard to predefine in detail what that could look like without really doing the groundwork to imagine it. Mm-hmm. But I think a lot about this question in terms of what might it look, feel, and act like. And in my mind, the notion of a national R&D infrastructure that really regards what's happening on the ground as truth, not just as annoyance, that it might look more like citizen journalism or door-to-door salesman than it does the sort of policy, the expectation of policy alone shaping, or innovations alone shaping that end experience.
Yeah. Over there and then,
My name's Brad Stam, and I'm with ConnectEd, the California Center for College and Career. And prior to transitioning, I was one of those buyers who you were talking about. I was chief academic officer in Oakland Unified and also worked in San Francisco Unified. And the issue of really knowing what to buy and why to buy it is, I agree with you, a fundamental problem. And one of the things that I always wished existed was when we think about when we want to buy an appliance or when we want to go to a restaurant, what do we look at? We look at Zagat, we look at consumer reports, we look at Yelp to get other people's opinions. And Consumer Reports goes farther in that it has specific criteria that it applies across a range of products and then assesses those products based upon those business requirements. And it would seem to me that there's a role either for state departments or associations or intermediary organizations to help cut through the clutter and help. It would help to assuage or attenuate feelings on the buyer's part frequently that it's a pretty predatory market out there, that a lot of these companies, unfortunately, don't necessarily have the interests of the students fully at heart, but are also pursuing a bald profit motive. And we get sold a lot of snake oil and a lot of inferior products that we just find out over time aren't really delivering on the promise in the marketing package. And so I just wanted to know what your thoughts were about roles that different institutions could play or where you've seen this be effectively applied in the education marketplace. Because one of my worries about the sort of onslaught of innovation that technology and technological advances are facilitating is that we're actually just going to get more of this uninformed purchasing and predatory selling in the education marketplace.
Well, one approach to that is look at other markets and see how do they get coordinated information and data. Education is hard. There is the What Works Clearinghouse that has been an attempt to try to get at that. Some folks, I think, may feel that that's not quite practical enough. Part of it is, especially within larger districts, is beginning to get very comfortable running your own pilots and actually looking at your own data to see, I see the chart, but let's see how this works with my kids. Because ultimately, that really is the final thing. And beginning to ask that question and beginning to support those kinds of things is a way of getting companies used to that. I mean, entrepreneurial CEOs especially, they are totally market-faced. And so if people start asking for that kind of information, they're going to find a way to start providing it at the level that gets the yes, I think.
But I'd like to see the education community be able to articulate what it is that they would like to see, even if it doesn't exist on the marketplace, to say, in this subject area, we'd like to see a learning environment such that a student that is 2 or 3 grade levels behind would catch up after a year of using this or something like that. And then hold vendors accountable to that type of standard and say, if you develop something that actually reliably produces that learning outcome, then we'll buy it.
Nicole. It would be nice to also crowdsource feedback from users to developers. One of the things I love about the App Store is that people put out a product, users instantly get feedback, and the iterations that apps go through, because it's very visible what the feedback is to the users. So as a developer, if you don't address the feedback that you're getting, then your reviews and ratings go down. So there has to be a way that we can provide more information from the actual users, not just the teachers, not just the district, but actually the students, about the quality and effectiveness of a particular book, technology that's being used.
So what's the Angry Bird of learning?
Yeah, right. There you go.
The Florida Virtual School is an interesting model on this for maybe an extreme reason, but they get about 11% funding for each student up front, and then they get the 89-90% only if the student successfully completes the course. It's a really different paradigm when you can go to an online provider and say, love to use you, we'll pay you when it works for each individual student. Okay, so then you have a second question, which is if you're the LEA or the district, you probably may not have the systems, the back-end systems, to be able to track that success down to the student level. Well, that suggests a great role for the state to be able to step in there with the information system that actually tracks down to that and ties the funding with that, so that you can start to work out agreements where you feel more confident, and it's not just one more pilot and the company spends 2 years gearing up for the pilot, and then they sink because, by the way, they've spent all their resources on this one thing, which isn't a particularly productive path to commercialization either.
That may also be a role for the Common Core, too, right? The assessments and the standards is to allow folks to do pilots that apply across all 50 states or 40 states instead of having to do a different one in each state. So,
we have a question up here.
Barry Breyer with Infinite Campus. We're a private match for one of the winning I3s and also the student information system for about 2,000 districts across the country. Going back to your question, you're urging districts and states to be smarter consumers. We've been approached by Research One universities, we've been approached by RELs saying we'd love to research the impact of your product in school districts. And we turn them down because our customers and our prospects are telling us we're not interested in that data. So how does Aspen Institute, CCSSO, some other convening authority bring together decision makers to educate them on the value of that kind of information? Because we're up for the game.
I'm the broken record here. I can't, but I mean, I agree with you. They don't value it because policy doesn't value it, and policy dictates that decision, and so that's a policy-moving conversation. And so, I don't want to. I think I know what Susan's final question is, and that this is probably part of my answer. But I do think that there needs to be a concerted effort in each of the states to start changing the equation of mandating how the dollars get spent and being much more clear about the outcomes and pushing down the decision-making process on how they get spent to people on the ground.
So I think Michael is really cheating because he knows I'm going to only allow him one thing to wave his wand about. He's getting one in earlier.
That's amazing.
Other questions? All the way in the back.
Keith Kruger with COSIN, the consortium.
Could you hold the mic a little closer?
Sure.
Thank you.
Keith Kruger with COSIN. We're the chief technology officers of school districts. And I wanted to follow up Tom's bold challenge that are there any of the willing? I think COSIN is willing to join with others on sort of the sort of opportunity for educators to put out ideas. And if there are others that are interested in working on that, please see me and Tom, because we want to do something about that right away. The question for the panel I have is, for existing institutions like school districts, our folks see themselves as the innovation officers, but how do you get the superintendent, the head of curriculum, who get siloed funding from public policy? How do you get them to work together in new and powerful ways? And what's the role of the reauthorized ESEA in order to facilitate that sort of conversation towards innovation?
I would say that when, with all due respect, if your chief technology officer is your only chief information officer, you have some risks because it puts the burden on you to know all about learning and instruction and what's happening in the classroom when your focus is on systems and huge challenges there. So yeah, I mean, really, that's a challenge because you want, ideally, in education, your chief innovation folks ought to be your teachers and superintendents and folks directly involved in curriculum instruction. And so, part of that is, how do you get them engaged with this? What's odd is everyone talks about how important learning is, and no one would ever say, well, that's not really part of my job. But somehow the systems, the incentives, except for some of the federal initiatives recently, Race to the Top and the I3 initiatives, but the Race to the Top especially, they seem to have galvanized these groups to come together again. So there must be something to learn from there. So. Tom, anyone? It's a tough question.
This is going to be the last question from right there. Yep.
Hi, Arthur Cammons, Jefferson County Public Schools in Louisville, Kentucky. We're one of the I3 development winners. While we're waiting for the next generation of assessments, on the ground in our lowest performing schools around the country, I think there's a tension between the space required for innovation, flexibility, risk-taking on the one hand, and pressure for short-term improvement on the other. And I'm wondering if the panel could comment on what might be done about that from a policy perspective.
Well, one approach, again, is to look outside. It's not an either-or situation. Typically, when you look at R&D, investments in organizations, businesses, you'll find some fraction of money is spent in various categories of effort, if you will. A couple percent on pure R, 5 to 10% on R&D, and then you have the real operational work that goes on. So I think the trick is to find a small amount of space, and that's the policy question, is how do you reward that, incent that, allow that? How do you carve out space for creative educators who want to do that and allow them, the time to fail in some ways? And I think that's a leadership piece. I think they can do it.
That's what I was going to go with it just briefly, and I think it answers Keith's question a little bit as well, and a question you asked him much earlier, Susan, which is if you're trying to manage maybe these two systems, how do you do that? And that really is the job of leadership. One of the things that has emerged from our research is how hard it is as the leader in an industry to disrupt yourself, right, and make that process. And where you see the successful ones, it was great leadership that was able to set aside a small area and let it grow organically and have different resources and processes and be dual managing. And it's not easy. It's not an easy answer for better or for worse. One of the things that I think that, to the extent that's possible, and it's hard to dig into this, starting to figure out ROI actually, students in these circumstances, if we do this has a huge return, but this is actually, credit recovery doesn't work if you're severely undercredited. You need alternative schools, and there's more bang for the buck there. And starting to think in a little more nuanced ways, I think, would be really important.
I'll just add a small comment to that. There's that expression, it's hard to fly the plane and build the plane at the same time. It's probably even more difficult to fly the plane, build the plane, and redesign the plane at the same time. And so one of the things I look at with that is how you differentiate structures. And I think this notion of creating space and in a way isolate the question of redesign so that a lot of your energy can focus on the flying and or the building, whichever the priority is at the moment, but to not forget about the redesigning the plane. That maybe it happens in an annual question, maybe it happens in the data systems that you build to be looking for certain indicators, but keeping that question alive maybe in a separate group sets the conditions for that to happen later.
What we found is that oftentimes in the lowest performing schools, they have access to resources to extend the day. And we've created the out-of-school space, intentionally used the out-of-school space as a design space to do innovative approaches with the understanding that we are going to connect those approaches back into the school day. So we use it as a hothouse, if you will, where we bring teachers in to see what's going on and that they can embrace it without having to, change on a dime. And we've seen over time that once there's a place for them to embrace, then they begin to pull it into their practice. So trying to be creative about what are the dollars that are out there to support increasing learning in these spaces where they're low performing. And I think you can think creatively about how to attack the problem in spaces where you're enabled more flexibility, but you have to be thinking in the creation of that of how you're going to bring it back into the school day.
Mm-hmm. So those were wonderful questions, and I know that people will have access to these folks, these brilliant minds, after the panel. But I wanted to leave people with some really concrete suggestions on if these folks could wave their wand and do only one thing. And there's obviously a huge collection of ideas and of ways we need to work to move forward, but I've asked them to choose one, recognizing that there's more than one thing to do. I'm going to start with Michael and work our way down this way so that we can all walk away with a short to-do list from this panel.
So myself, along with several others in this room and so forth, with Governors Jeb Bush and Bob Wise, recently worked on the production of this report from the Digital Learning Council called Digital Learning Now. It has 10 principles. So that's 10 things, I apologize.
I was part of that.
But it's part of one. Digital Learning Now. Check it out. Guilty. 10 elements of high-quality digital learning. And it's really a state-focused set of policy principles that I think if those were in place, it would incentivize a lot of these behaviors we're talking about right now.
And was there one on that list that you just want us to pay particular attention to?
Yeah, so competency-based learning and moving away from seat time and tying funding to outcomes would be my one.
Okay, thank you. Sandy?
The one thing that I'm thinking is we absolutely need these innovations, but we also need to consider the need for innovators. And I think platforms like the I3 funds, this event, what Startle is doing, are great examples of how we're sparking people to see their role in the changes that we need ahead. And I think this applies on all levels. I think this applies to what kids are learning and how they see themselves in part of shaping the future. I think this applies to teachers. I think this applies to schools. I think this applies on every level of the system. So my question for you all would be, in what you're doing, how can you spark, how can you create the opportunity for other people to see themselves as innovators in this challenge, big challenge we all have?
Thank you.
Well, picking one that's a bit agonizing. But I think I would go back to the learning.
Just having fun with you.
I know. I would go back to the learning networks. The idea of creating a semi-professionalized collection of classrooms, and let me make it more generalized, a semi-professionalized collection of teachers and students with environments that have 50 or more teachers, several thousand students, targeting each competence, to use the, I'm trying to get away from classrooms, right? Targeting each competence that become used to participating in various scales of development trials. So it becomes faster and more efficient for folks with ideas that have some rationale and promise to quickly find out, is this going to work? And then, frankly, you get information at the end about usability, right? About, can this actually work? Can actually human beings execute this thing? Or is it like a 9.7 off the big board that only 5% of teachers can execute? And you need scale to do that, but we need sets of folks who are used to doing that. I think that would really be helpful.
And can you just tell us briefly what you mean by a competence?
A competence would be a specific, measurable, behavioral objective that ties to some later important success factor. So it could be a job competence when you're at the end of things, some specific aspect of work that you're trying to train up that you can narrow down to measure and talk about, or it could be a prerequisite like something about better nonfiction writing, essay writing, persuasive essays, that then ties into so many later competences. So the idea is a measurable, specific, teachable objective within networks of those.
Thank you. Great. Nicole?
Okay, and you took the learning network idea.
Sorry.
I'm going to extend it.
So you're lucky, you get two.
I'm going to extend it. At the end of the day, most of this boils down to is a student engaged and willing to engage in whatever we put in front of them to learn. So anything we talk about has to hit or address the core of student agency. And so I think if we begin to expand learning, take the learning network, and instead of just focusing on classroom teachers, but focus on learning that takes place in all the places where kids spend their time, and think of so many people as their teachers and their mentors, but figure out how to, with the infrastructure, technical infrastructure, to count learning that's taking place in these other places as evidence of learning across the Common Core. We can do it, we just have to figure out, we just have to be committed to doing it.
Thank you. And Tom?
I've got one idea. It has two phases. In phase one...
These guys are all too smart for me.
In phase one, there's an ideation competition. And the ideation competition asks a very simple question, which is, if you could come up with a dream RFP that identifies a specific learning outcome that is ambitious but achievable, so it doesn't happen next year, but in the medium term, what would it be? So people could then come out of the woodwork and say, here's a learning objective that A, we think is strategic important, and B, there's a rough consensus that we know how to measure it. So that's what would happen in phase one. And then in phase two, some coalition of the willing would get together and say, yes, we agree that that's important, we agree that this is ambitious but achievable, and we are willing to pre-commit dollars so that if some combination of the research community and the private sector can develop this, we will buy it. I'm not saying it'll work. I'm just saying that given the huge impact that it's had in the global health area, it's worth experimenting with in the educational sector.
Thank you. So Michael, Sandy, Roar, Nicole, and Tom, and this amazing audience, I want to thank you for your participation. I hope everyone has a great to-do list to go home with, and look forward to continuing the conversation with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It was wonderful.
Thank you again to all of our panelists. As you make your way out of your seats, we invite you each to please visit the exhibit booths. Each exhibit has been carefully selected to be a part of our program and are showcasing valuable opportunities and innovations for education. Your experience today is definitely not complete without paying them a visit.
You've waited for so long to be where